Do you want to take another one to pass on to Frank?
Yeah, we'll
take one.
So we're recording.
Okay.
And yeah,
just. Am I talking to you or the camera?
Talking to me.
No, right,
talking to me.
So turn that a bit. Okay.
So interview with Professor Kevin Anderson of the Tyndall Centre on the 22nd?
22nd is it, or 23rd? I can't remember.
Thereabouts. 23rd of November, 2015. So the obvious topic of conversation is the upcoming climate change conference in Paris. I've been reading The Spin, which seems to be, everyone admits that the INDCs, the internationally something declared commitments,
intended nationally determined contributions.
If you add them all up, you get 2.7 degrees, and that's if everyone does them. So this is the version I've heard. You might say that they're going to be higher. The temperature rise would be higher than that.
Yes, I think you have to be very careful about adding them up. Firstly, they're not all in the same. They don't all have the same sort of units. Some of them are intensity targets, and in other words, what we'll do relative to the growth in our economy. But who knows what the growth in their economy
will be. Like the Chinese is an intensity target.
Like that. So others have got targets a bit more like the EU have, which are more absolute targets. And in fact, to the credit of the EU, despite the fact that I think they're half the level they needed to be, but at least the level that put forward is one that they're not then going to offset through various mechanisms elsewhere. So we will not be paying for mitigation rates elsewhere that we will claim as our reductions. So there's a degree of, if you like, honesty I like in the EU ones, but they're only half the size they need to be for 2 degrees C. So they've all got these different ways of putting them together. Then you add them all up. Now the problem is the INDCs only go out to 2030. So you first have to make some assumptions about what's going to happen between now and 2020, what's going to happen post 2030. Now those assumptions are absolutely pivotal in this. You also have to think about, well, what are the carbon budgets that they relate them to, and do you assume negative emission technologies? In other words, are we going to suck the CO2 out of the air in the future? And of course that is assumed in a lot of the assessments that are made about how significant are these contributions. So I would go slightly further. Usually the UNEP gap report has gone through them reasonably carefully. And in that, they say broadly that, depending how you read them, there are between a 3 and a 4 degrees C temperature rise with the INDCs. My understanding is, from someone who's been trying to chase up some of the details, that even with that range, they are including some negative emissions. So if you remove negative emissions from it... Then
what are negative emissions, Kevin?
Negative emissions are they're a technique that we've developed, a ruse that we've developed to allow us to carry on doing what we're doing today, and it will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future.
So this isn't carbon and capture and storage which prevents more CO2 going into the atmosphere. This is us coming up with artificial trees?
Well, yes and no. I think I have to be quite careful about this. Almost all of the integrated assessment models, all the main models that are used for advising government on what we need to do, virtually all of those models for 2 degrees C include some form of negative emission technology, and they almost always include the same sort, which is called BECCS, and it's biomass energy carbon capture and storage.
So is that planting trees and then dumping them in the deep ocean?
It's slightly more sophisticated than that, but
good,
not much more.
Good. So the technology will save us still.
Yes, definitely, according to this. What they're going to do is plant lots and lots of biomass trees, other biomass, other plants, depending where they're going to be around the planet. You grow them, and as they grow, they suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. You harvest them.
Yeah.
You then ship them to wherever you're going to produce energy, so generally into power stations. You burn them in power stations and produce some energy, and then you capture the carbon dioxide that goes up the chimney, up the flue, and then you use you use carbon capture and storage technology. You capture the carbon dioxide, you almost liquefy it, and then you store it somewhere at high pressure, deep in a reservoir, like an old oil reservoir. And so in that way, the plant grows and sucks the CO2 out of the air, and then we capture that CO2 at the back end of the power station and store it. So that is sucking the CO2 out of the air. Now that is embedded.
Because there's lots of space left on this planet and lots of water to grow all those trees.
These are some of the really huge concerns that thankfully are really coming to the fore now. That a lot of people think there are incredibly naive assumptions in the integrated assessment models about the level of biomass that they're about to use. So you'd be trying to feed, say, 9 billion people whilst trying to produce huge amounts of biomass. for this particular BECCS technologies, at the same time as the aviation industry expects to be using biomass for its planes, the shipping industry expects to use biomass for its ships, the chemical industry will be using some biomass, and the car industry already is using 7% of the fuel that we buy is biomass. So when you look at the total amount of biomass around the planet, that you end up asking some sort of quite serious questions. Is that in any way or shape viable? In addition, you have to then ship, remember you've got to ship this biomass all the way around the planet. That's not an insignificant task in itself. There are problems with storing biomass. As you store biomass, the longer you store it, and depending on how you store it, you get lots of emissions from it. So it can be much better than coal, but it can also be much worse than coal.
Because trees rot.
Trees rot, yeah. There's a recent paper out by Roeder and Thornley that looks at this actually. When you store biomass, what are the additional emissions? So you have to be quite careful about that as well. And these sorts of details are generally missing from these very top-down, high-level integrated assessment models.
Okay, what is an integrated assessment model? Because you and I understand a lot of people here won't.
An integrated assessment model they're very large computer models where what they've done is they've taken the climate science, which is difficult in itself, but at least we've got it broadly abides by the rules of physics, so that we understand that. Well, it does abide by the rules of physics, so we understand those bits well. They're complicated, but they're understood. And then it tags onto those economic models about how the economy of the world works, which you might ask we don't fully understand given some of the things we've seen recently over the last sort of 5-6 years.
Some rich woman ask how come the economists hadn't spotted the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, that's
I forget what her name was.
Certainly there are lots of people raising questions about the economic, our understanding of an economic system, a particularly globalised economic system. And then on top of that, they tie in things about understanding of behaviour. And they put these things together and they can work out what are the best technologies to use. Because they have everything's price optimised, cost optimised. So they have prices in there, or costs. They have costs in there for biomass energy carbon capture and storage in 2050 and 2070. Even though we do not have any of these technologies available today, we're not producing the sorts of levels of biomass in any way that we would need for this anyway in the future. We haven't got this huge global demand for this biomass material, yet they've got a relatively accurate price for some period, decades away in the future, that they then say that is price optimally, that's the best way to go. Rather than making the big changes today, you make some changes today, but not too many, and then we have these optimized, price-optimized technologies decades from today that will suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
3 words: collateralized debt obligations. Is this any different to the accountancy, jiggery, pokery, fiddly nonsense that blew up in our faces less than 10 years ago with the financial sector?
I think there are real concerns about this route because it is. The people doing it are very genuine. But I would argue then they're not particularly contextual, and I don't think really that they have thought about where else have we tried these sorts of techniques. Not just the technology themselves, but this way of this sort of accounting over very long periods of time. Yeah. Where else have we tried these techniques, and has it worked reliably? And I think we can see some of the other techniques, some of the other accounting practices we've had more recently, where it has proved really very difficult. So it's not just myself that's very sceptical about these integrated assessment scenarios, but also lots and lots of other natural scientists now are coming to the fore saying we are really very deeply and genuinely concerned about this. And the other thing which I've not touched on, which is really important, is there is an assumption, and it's basically it's a crossed-finger, crossed-leg assumption, that the climate will not hit back during the period where we're starting to develop these technologies.
So we have a nice, smooth, linear change as opposed to
any sort of feedback.
A beast waking up, as Wally Broker says.
Yes, yeah. And there are many scientists who talk about these feedback issues and say, well, this is a very dangerous approach to think that you're going to suck a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in 2050, 60, 70 and later. And that in the interim, you're not going to get climate feedbacks from the escalating levels of CO2.
Okay.
So they're a big issue. And one thing whenever you hear people talking about climate change now, particularly high-level talks, be very cautious about 2 words. First, they say we must reach 0 or below, and by below they mean and we will suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future, or the word net zero. These are 2 words that are creeping in, and they're becoming part of our new discourse. And what that means is we will find a technology in the future to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere rather than making the changes today. So people like me would argue we need to go to 0 emissions, actually genuinely 0 emissions from our energy system. Other people would argue we need to go to net zero. So that means we can carry on doing what we're doing now, and in the future we'll suck the CO2 out with biomass energy, carbon capture and storage.
For any Australians of a certain age, my age or older, Bex is a headache tablet. You need a Bex and a good lie down, and that's how I feel about climate change a lot of the time. So the question started with this idea that, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that we shouldn't. 2.7. And they've admitted, or they're admitting, the Australian delegation, for example, is admitting that Paris will not deliver 2 degrees, but the Paris process will put us on the pathway, because the idea is that a deal is made in Paris, everyone shakes hands, and then they come back every 5 years to see what progress is being made. Now, if that is the outcome, what would your response be?
Well,
why doesn't that help? Isn't near enough good enough?
No, well, I think your opening statement, if it's only 2.7, but I would have to say you have to question that straight away. That 2.7 is only there because you've turned in your integrated assessment model, you've dialed in a certain level of sucking the CO2 out of the air. So all these assumptions about we will be part of a process towards 2 degrees C, every element of failure in that just means you ratchet up the dial on the sucking the CO2 out, the BECS. And so that's what's happening. And that's what we're actually doing. So we're going to go to Paris with these INDCs, which are not consistent with science or on the basis of equity, which is what we signed up to do. So
in 1992?
Well, the Copenhagen Accord, 2000.
Yeah.
So the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, 2010 said we will stay below 2 degrees centigrade. So it doesn't say a 50-50 chance of. It says we will stay below, consistent with science and on the basis of equity.
Okay.
We now find ourselves in 2015 going to the Paris negotiations where we do not have submissions that the INDCs are not consistent with science. We're anyway not aiming to stay below 2 degrees C, and there's virtually no element of equity in there either. So we've failed on all of the 3 components of what we've repeatedly signed up to.
Why?
Because really there are lots of reasons, but most significantly I think climate change is a cumulative problem. It's the build-up of carbon dioxide every single day, every single year in the atmosphere. The problem with that is, if you don't do something now, the problem is more challenging tomorrow. And if you don't do something tomorrow, it's more challenging again. So you almost, because of our ongoing failure, what you almost get is the challenge that you face becomes exponentially more difficult. And as that happens, each time we've failed, then when you go to the political framework and sort of say, well, what can we do? They're sort of saying, well, this is too challenging for us. Let's delay it till later. But the problem, that delay makes the challenge more, as I say, much more difficult again. So if we think about this relative to 1990, we had the first IPCC report came out in 1990, a quarter of a century ago. The emissions this year will be 60% higher than they were in 1990. Since the last report in 2007, we've put another 200 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The problem in 2015 is that we have used up virtually all of our carbon budget. So we are left in this incredibly difficult position now, whereby we either have to magic up technologies for the future that are going to solve the problem, like BECS. And I think it's not unreasonable to have 1 in 10 scenarios that includes BECS, but if 10 out of 10 scenarios include BECS, that's a systemic bias.
But the numbers can't add up otherwise, Kevin.
The numbers can't add up unless you're prepared to ask other questions about our society. And those questions are ones we're not allowed to ask. So they're questions about how we live our lives, the concept of economic growth, distribution of... I'm careful how I say this. It's the lion's share of the emissions come from a relatively small proportion of the population. And in the short to medium term, it is those people that have to make these radical changes to how...
You and me.
Yes, people like us have to make these radical changes to our levels of emissions, which actually means very clearly to how we live our lives. And of course we are the policymakers. Our friends and families, people come to our universities.
Rich, white, middle-class men.
Generally, mostly. Yes, mostly men. Well, yeah. I mean, these things are changing, and it's not just in the Western world either. I mean, there are 300 million people in China who consume like we do.
Yeah.
In the West, obviously in Europe. So there's a particular group of people who have to make these radical changes, but we are the ones. We're like the foxes guarding the chicken coop, and we've got to say, put up better guards against the chickens. So there's a real problem here for us in that we are the ones that have to come up with policies that say that people like us have to change our lives. And because we're reluctant to do that, because it's a cumulative problem, the only other button that we have available is this one about some sort of technology in the future, because we have the two buttons. One is about adjust the economic framing of our current contemporary society now, so you can adjust that knob, or you adjust the other one, which says some technology in the future is going to solve the problem for us, and you've got the choice between the two. At the moment, we have continually shied away from the one that says this begs fundamental questions about how we live our lives. And I think one really good example of this, I was sat at home this week, sat working on my computer, and up-pinged something about the forthcoming Paris negotiations. It was an opportunity for me to offset my carbon emissions going to Paris. Now, I think that's problematic anyway, very more than problematic.
Yep.
But besides that, it then said if you travel business class, you have to double the amount of the offset. Now, to me, that was the perfect cue to explain why it is we're not prepared to make those sorts of changes. Rather than saying it is wrong to travel business class in a time when climate change is serious, what you simply get is you have to double the level of your offset to allow you to travel business class.
Why is it wrong to travel business class if you've got the money? Plane's going anyway.
Well, this is the old argument that everything's going anyway. You are a market signal. So you're part of the huge growth in aviation, but this is the same for every sector. And the problem with the particular problem with aircraft is that we don't have any low carbon alternatives. So the problem with flying is if you embed flying more deeply in our society, then you're locking yourself into a high carbon future. And if you are going to say we need some aviation in our society, and I think these are arguments that need to be had, I don't think they're quite as clear cut as some people would suggest. If you are going to have them, then at least say well we should be flying each person with the lowest carbon footprint as possible. I'm not saying we should have larger and larger chairs; they should have bars they can walk around on. So that you look at some of the adverts for this sort of first and business class travel, and you look, all of that material goods are being flown around the planet as well as the person sitting there. Now, if you're on an EasyJet plane or a Ryanair plane, you're squashed in with lots and lots of other people. They're much more efficient in terms of carbon per seat. But the eyepiece that UNFCCC is offering an offset for you to travel business class seems to me to demonstrate that we're not prepared to even contemplate touching the button that says we may have to adjust some of the ways that we live our lives.
Well, it would be a courageous politician in the yes minister courageous sense of getting booted out in the next election, wouldn't it?
Well, I'm not sure how many. Depends which party you were in. I think I'm not sure how many people necessarily that travel business class are going to vote.
Well, I meant more generally on the economic growth question anyway.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's when I think we have to be quite careful then. Start to say, well, pull that apart. What does that mean? Firstly, what we're talking about here is we're not talking about it at a global level. We're saying, well, we still want to see improvements in economic wherewithal for the poor parts of the world. That means their emissions in the short term will go up, which means ours have to come down even faster. And then we say, well, what about with our society? We've got 25 million households in the UK, of which about 20% are in fuel poverty. I want their emissions to go up, because in the short term, that's the way they can improve the quality of their lives and their children's lives, bronchial health problems and all those things that will be occurring this winter because they cannot afford energy. So please, I would like, for me, I would like the government to be saying we will find some mechanism whereby you can increase your energy consumption this winter, you will have more carbon dioxide emissions, which then simply says to people like me, I have to reduce mine still further. So when we talk about...
But obviously we'd need to insulate their houses.
Yeah, but that takes longer.
And then we could have a Green Deal.
Well, the problem with things like the Green Deal, these are distractions. We wrestle over crumbs.
Okay.
We gave 375 billion to the banks, and what was the Green Deal? 3.5 billion. I mean, and then we argue about it, and that's it's a very clever, sophisticated technique. Get us to argue about the crumbs that are handed down to us to deal with climate change, and then we're distracted from the real issue, which actually what we're talking about are sorts of monies that we gave to the banks to try to solve that problem. I would argue climate change is much more serious than the banking crisis, and actually we could have, if we're being moderately astute here, we could have combined the two. We could have actually given the money, put the money back into society through quantitative easing, through printing the money, and we could have had people retrofitting their houses in the UK, and that would have kept people employed, put the money back in the economy.
This was the rhetoric in 2008, and it was only the South Koreans who came anywhere close to a green
deal. Yes, yeah. It was pretty much all the Western countries spent very little of their quantitative easing, of their printing money and putting it back into the economy on anything that was green. And in this case, it wouldn't just have been green, it would have helped eliminate things like fuel poverty, which has helps with your health issues with children with these bronchial issues. So you end up with a sort of systems way of thinking about these issues, but we compartmentalise everything. We do that in universities, and governments do that as well. We do that in our own lives.
You have a minister for transport, a minister for environment, a minister for X, Y, Z, and the civil servants behind them are in silos, but the problems are so complex I can't imagine a government of everything for everything where the thinking was genuinely integrated.
Well, we may not be able to imagine it, but if we cannot imagine it, if we cannot put that in place, then we're lost as in our current sort of framing of human civilization, if that's what we have. And then that is not going to survive unless we can start to think of how to solve systemic problems.
Yes.
The difficulty we have, I think, on this, these are sort of quite sort of deep, fundamental issues, is that we have spent...
I'd never go easy on you, Kevin.
We've spent at least 200 years, if not 2,000 years, developing very successfully the concept of reductionist ways of analysing the world. They have been phenomenally successful.
They have.
Coming from an engineering background, you look at, that's how I was trained, and that's how the industrialisation of the western part of the world, and many parts of the world, it was premised on that reductionist, phenomenally successful reductionist way of looking at the world.
We are now in Australia safely and back again.
Yes, yeah. And we're now in 2015 in a globalised world where actually we are now facing challenges that are systemic. So we are still trying to apply reductionist tools to understand systemic challenges, and they just don't go together. You wouldn't do that in other areas of science.
We can understand these challenges, we just don't seem to be able to do anything about them.
Well, I'm still not certain we can understand them. I mean, that's part of the reason you said before, we need a government minister that was there to sort of head, if you like, integration across the government ministries. But we still don't understand how important it is yet to put that position in place, even if, when they're in place, then how would they actually achieve it? I don't think we're yet sufficiently advanced to understand what it means to think about systemic challenges, let alone how we're going to try to resolve them. So I think we are in a very difficult position because we're facing with these challenges now. I mean, climate change is a very good example. We're faced with these challenges, but without the toolkit to respond to them. Now, as an academic, we might think that's quite attractive. We've got a blank sheet of paper, and we think we'd be getting some funding to try to think about, well, what would the solution space look like? But actually, in reality, we're just desperately scrabbling around with any old technique we can use. So we use reductionist BECs, we use reductionist economic tools like offsetting being one, or emissions trading scheme, or a carbon tax scheme. These are all little piecemeal approaches we're trying to think about. We're not actually standing back from this and thinking, well, what are these systemic issues that we're trying to face, and how is it we're going to start trying to address those? And I'm not saying it's easy, I don't think it is. I think we are really in a very difficult position because we do not have the wherewithal intellectually or historically, or the precedents to know how to progress. So perhaps thinking about things like ecology might help us. There are sciences that do think about these sets of issues.
I've been filming half your face.
Oh, do you want to start from the start?
No, I don't want to start from the start.
Start. I could do it much better if we start again.
No.
What time's the?
We're starting about now. You moved in the chair, or I didn't set it up correctly. It's fine.
Let's do the whole lot. It's much better if it's done properly now, so I can think about them more better now. I can make the answers more succinct.